the average sponsorship deal with a team is, at best 10% digital, right? I mean, they are grossly underselling or locked out of these rights and benefits. Google and Facebook are getting, sort of like it's estimated about 95% plus of digital sales growth year over year, 3 or 4 years in a row now. So sports, which dominated leisure time, interest, passion, right, audience, and all those traditional media mediums, is not in the game here, basically locked out of this game right now. I don't know. I mean, if you have advice for those people who are listening, or what do they do? I know I'm making you compete with yourself here, but what do they do so that they can sell what your team is selling, right? Which is the future. Because I don't have
Yeah.
an answer. I mean, how do they suddenly turn their inventory into 50% or more digital? Because that's kind of what they need right now, right? That's where the media buying world is there. Digital past television years ago.
So I don't know the answer, and it's certainly not for me to give advice, I suppose, to those that have been so successful in the traditional sports space. It's interesting. It's less about the solutions. If I were in any of those shoes today, if I was working in any of the leagues that I've worked in prior to landing here at Overactive Media, I think my biggest concern understanding the esports and gaming space broadly would be not only how do I reach them, but even if I can figure out a way to reach them, how do I do it in fashion that makes sense to this generation? Because if you don't do it, if you're not smart about it, if you're not sensitive to the way this generation thinks about it, you're just as likely to get locked out by virtue of having landed in that conversation in a way that doesn't make sense to them. It's not authentic. They don't believe. They feel like you're an interloper and not there to stay, right? Is difficult, I think, to imagine a way in. And that's why we made the investments in the teams that we did, because it gave us products to lean on, a story to tell, and an authentic connection to point to for our partners. Our brands, you mentioned very generously that some of the partner deals we've got. Bell can land authentically in the connection, of course, by virtue of the work that they do with their fiber technology and soon their 5G. That's a little easier to understand if you're an esports gaming fan. If you're TD Bank, then you're racking your brain trying to figure out how you're going to make sense to this generation. And the reason TD is invested in Overactive Media is in large part because we can land them there safely, because they can show up and be talking to our audience. And the audience gives them the credit that they deserve because they're supporting the teams that audience believes in and likes to cheer for and support, right? It's a safe place to land. If you're a pro sports team, and I don't know, I've got friends all over the country like you do, and if you're not invested in esports, I think you're struggling right now to figure it out. And I've talked to some of our friends about exactly that. If you don't own an esports or gaming or influencer position around your brand, if it doesn't extend around beyond your basketball team, your hockey team, your football team, then you're speaking to a relatively narrow percentage of that audience. Most of them are my age or older right now. And that's a problem. That's a problem that, I'm not signaling the demise of the NFL or any of the major leagues, but it was funny. I was watching Pittsburgh Steelers game, I think it was yesterday, and they were promoting in advance the Nickelodeon wildcard game. Did you happen to see that?
Yeah.
And that's today, at least. That's largely the NFL's answer for appealing to, parenthetically, the next generation of fans. If that's it, that's a fairly narrow perspective.
Yeah. Well, I know you're trying to be kind to all our mutual friends out there, but there is a pathway to fandom problem. I mean, this is something we have studied for one of the big four sports leagues not so long ago, and there's two problems actually. One, winning leisure time and share of time with those folks at a much lower rate. And the second one is that they're dropping off mid. There was this history where someone would follow this curve of fandom, start trading baseball cards, find your favorite team, whatever it is. Let's say it plateaus in your late 20s and slow decline the rest of your life. People are jumping off that traditional curve. And so it is a problem actually. And again, the leagues aren't going to go bankrupt, but it's one of those things where, it's not a problem until it is, right? Like it's not hard to read the tea leaves and see right now what's going on with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, by the way, which I don't think anybody really talks much about now, but coming quick on their heels.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're defining generations in shorter numbers of years now, which actually makes sense based on behavior or what have you. What would you do if you're those leagues? And I don't mean to belabor the point, but you've been there, that you spend the majority of your career there. If you were there, is there an action you would take to be authentic to those generations? They don't have the digital rights to sell. The league deal in the NFL example with Nickelodeon, they're willing to pay for those rights, right? But realistically, it's short form, it's social, digital, mobile. Is there an action you would take
I don't know that there's one or two macro solutions, but I think there are some isolated things you could be thinking about. And similarly, I'll say it the other way. I think esports needs to be thinking more like traditional sport in some regard as well. And we can touch on that in a minute. But the broadcast is probably the one that I think of first when I think about innovation opportunities for traditional sport. And we're starting to see it, right? I mean, the NFL deal with Amazon is, I think, a step in that direction. I think that platform is going to give them the ability to do a bunch of things that they can't do on linear television, whether that be, fan engagement. One of the most compelling things for my 82-year-old father is watching Call of Duty with me last summer. He doesn't understand a thing that's happening, but he understands what's happening on the screen in the adjacent screen, which is the fans talking to each other about their favorite players, the favorite moves that happen in the game, the cheering for their team real time in this kind of combative text almost. I think there are elements of fan engagement on platforms like Amazon will afford the NFL, and I think the NHL did a over-the-top deal as well. I think you'll see innovations around content commerce within the broadcast as well, that again, those platforms will open up opportunities for. These are all things that exist and could exist today for esports. So I think some of what we're seeing is a migration of traditional sport logically to over-the-top platforms, but it might be for reasons beyond what we just intuitively think, because it's another avenue for naming rights or for media rights dollars, of course. But the flexibility that those digital platforms are going to provide to those traditional sports leagues, I think, is going to be real. And eventually, I think the return on that will be measured in all sorts of different revenue streams, not just the rights deals alone.